Today, as we continue our studies in Mark's account of Jesus' life, we begin with two short passages in a section of the book that probably extends to chapter 6 and verse 13. Together they all seem to include stories drawn from the later stages of Jesus' ministry in the Galilee, where so far he has been based. First then, as has been our practice, let me read to you Mark chapter 3 verses 7 to 19, where Mark says, Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the lake, and a large crowd from Galilee followed. When they heard about all he was doing, many people came to him from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, and the regions across the Jordan, and around Tyre and Sidon. Because of the crowd, he told his disciples to have a small boat ready for him, to keep the people from crowding him. For he had healed many, so that those with diseases were pushing forward to touch him. Whenever the impure spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, "You are the Son of God!" But he gave them strict orders not to tell others about him. Jesus then went up on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed 12, that they might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach and have authority to drive out demons. These are the 12 he appointed: Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. To them he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Two things should immediately strike us as we read these two paragraphs. First of all, the section begins by offering a contrast with the previous story. There the religious leaders had been aroused to plot against Jesus. Here the crowds welcome him. Secondly, though this is so, the ominous note with which the last section closed, the threat to kill Jesus, is matched here with the comment that Judas Iscariot, one of his own followers, would betray him. Popular acclaim, under the shadow of the threat of death, will follow Jesus right to the end. However, let's begin by reflecting upon the large crowd who welcomed Jesus' ministry. What is remarkable is the vast area from which they gathered. Mark tells us that they gathered from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, the regions across the Jordan, and around Tyre and Sidon. Tyre and Sidon were up to 50 miles away. It was 70 miles to Jerusalem, and parts of Judea, Beersheba for example, were 100 miles away, and Idumea was south of Beersheba. There were then many who journeyed well over 100 miles, through sometimes very difficult terrain, which required many days of travel in order to meet Jesus. What is also remarkable is that while Jerusalem and Judea was the heartland of the Jewish people, those from Idumea, Tyre and Sidon were usually known as Gentiles. In other words, people who were ethnically and religiously separated from the Jews. Mark is therefore telling us that Jews and non-Jews from a huge area were anxious to meet with Jesus. His fame had certainly spread. It's possible for us to learn a couple of lessons from this. The first is that often it's those without strong preconceived religious beliefs who find it easier to respond positively to Jesus. That can be true of each one of us. You and I may have friends who are so fixed in their views that they refuse to give Jesus a thought, unless it is to speak ill of him. Others, with more open minds, may be ready to seek him out for themselves. Perhaps that might be true of you. Secondly, and in the light of this, it's probably best to see Jesus' withdrawal to the lake as strategic. Jesus leaves the synagogue, and the learned religion of that place, and goes to where the ordinary people receive him gladly and are enriched by his ministry. This also highlights the fact that if the crowds seek Jesus, there is a sense in which he seeks them. I think Mark is suggesting that this was and is still the case. Jesus, he believed, will be found by those who look for him and actually find him coming to meet them in the way. Nevertheless, the passage seems to suggest that many in the crowd came to Jesus for inadequate reasons. They were fascinated and impressed by Jesus' miracles, but they didn't really understand who Jesus was. The paradox, of course, is that the evil spirits did grasp who he was, proclaiming him to be who he said he was, the Son of God. Ironically, therefore, Mark contrasts religious leaders with the common people, and the common people with demons. This should surely give us pause for thought. The second paragraph here is strikingly different from much of Mark's Gospel. It lacks the vivid detail characteristic of Mark's storytelling elsewhere. However, while the location and occasion is vague, this does not extend to the details offered regarding Jesus' call and the naming of the apostles. I would like to suggest that Mark has deliberately stripped the narrative bare to emphasize these very features. Specifically, the present passage seems to describe the formal appointment of 12 persons to be apostles and names them. Although it's only an intermediate step towards the final responsibilities they will be given. But why was this so important to Mark? And what does all this have to do with you and me? First of all, in view of the general lack of detail here, the reference to 12 is surely significant. In the Old Testament there were 12 men, the sons of a man called Jacob, who were the foundation upon which Israel was built, and they all became the tribal heads of the people of God. Here 12 others are chosen. Notice that they do not self-select or opt in, and they are given a unique office as the founding members of the people who will become followers of Jesus. This is consistent with Jesus' teaching that he is the one to whom the Old Testament points. All that had preceded him is provisional. Now he establishes the new people of God, the new Israel, founded upon 12 new leaders. By the time Mark wrote his book, this appears to have become clearly understood. The apostles would from then onwards be regarded as the ones whose memories of Jesus and whose teaching about him would become the standard of the Christian faith. These testimonies are now to be found in the New Testament writings, such as Mark. So while the word apostle is used differently elsewhere in the New Testament, of, for example, church planters and church delegates, Mark reflects a recognition that the 12 are special. In particular, they are regarded as the authorized recorders, interpreters and validators of Jesus' once and for all ministry. For us, this means we should always ask the question, what do the New Testament authors say about Jesus? Of course, one of the 12 would abandon and betray Jesus. The early church would therefore add someone else to make up the number, a man called Matthias. His appointment is recorded in the book of Acts and in the first chapter. Interestingly, God then made the number up to 13 by directly and miraculously choosing the Apostle Paul. But that is another story. A second point can also be made. While the apostles were unique and are here given a ministry of preaching and exorcism that is not delegated to all of us, they are also in another way representative of everyone who is a follower of Jesus. So to those of us who are Christians, we're reminded that we are chosen by Jesus. The Bible repeatedly tells us that none of us can become Christians without God's help, without his grace. Indeed, the Bible describes us as spiritually dead and tells us that only the Spirit of God can awaken us and enable us to welcome Jesus as our own. And all of this is based upon God's loving choice of us, irrespective of anything that we might have thought might have inclined him to us. So his choice is not based upon our status and gifting. In fact, the Bible delights to tell us that God usually turns the standards of the world upside down. Usually it's not those who are great or think they are that God chooses, or most of us would not stand a chance with him. No, it's ordinary people like us that he's delighted to love and make members of his own people. Now, of course, the idea that every Christian is chosen individually by God raises some very big questions which cannot be addressed here. However, the main reason that the Bible reveals this mystery is not to satisfy our minds, for our minds simply cannot understand it. No, the main reason is to reassure us. If God has chosen us and brought us into his family, he loves us so deeply that he's not going to abandon us. He will keep us even when things seem against us. And it's this fact that has helped millions of Christians to face persecution, martyrdom, and more simply, the difficulties and tragedies that life brings. But before we complete this study, I'd like to make two more observations. Jesus called the apostles to forsake everything to follow him. This is also true for everyone who wishes to follow him now. So we must be ready to place him first in our lives and to follow him wherever he leads us, not insist on our own priorities and desires. In fact, I would suggest it's often this challenge to humbly submit all we are to him that is the reason why people refuse to give Jesus a hearing. He simply seems to demand too much. But those who follow him know that for all the cost, true freedom and life in all its fullness can only be found in him. Once they've met Jesus, they have no lasting regrets. Yet not everything may be what it seems. Judas Iscariot followed Jesus, or seemed to, but as the account of Jesus' life shows, there was always something missing. His heart was never fully in his discipleship, and eventually he abandoned and betrayed Jesus. This means that if we say we're Christians, we need to be sure that our commitment is not merely a superficial one. Jesus demands our hearts and our wills, everything we are. No one is a true follower of Jesus unless this is true of them. The last paragraph in this section of Mark's story is not much more than a list, but as we can now see, it's a list that is clearly intended to provoke our reflection and to challenge each one of us, above all, to face up to the challenge that really following Jesus brings.